Mark and Sarah Chen drove into the Gifford Pinchot National Forest to celebrate their 5th anniversary. They packed light, told family they'd return Sunday night, and posted a smiling photo from the trailhead. Then they vanished. No distress calls, no credit card activity, no trace of their silver Honda CR-V at any parking area. Search helicopters found nothing. Cadaver dogs lost the scent. It was as if the forest had opened its mouth and swallowed them whole. Their families searched for years, walking the same trails, calling names that echoed unanswered. The case went cold. Detectives retired. Hope faded into grief. The wilderness kept its silence. Then, in October 2023, exactly 10 years later, 2 rangers documenting illegal logging noticed something unnatural buried in a remote ravine, metal beneath moss and roots. When they cleared the vegetation, they uncovered a vehicle consumed by the forest. The license plate confirmed their worst fear. Mark Chen woke up before the alarm. He always did on days that mattered. His wife Sarah was still asleep beside him, her dark hair spilled across the pillow, one arm draped over the blanket. Outside their modest Portland apartment, the early autumn light was just beginning to filter through the curtains. Mark slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake her, and started loading their camping gear into the back of their silver Honda CR-V. A 2-person tent, 2 sleeping bags rated for cold weather, a Coleman stove, a cooler packed with sandwiches, trail mix, and Sarah's favorite dark chocolate with sea salt. Everything they needed for 3 days in the wilderness, nothing more. They were celebrating their 5th wedding anniversary, not with a fancy dinner or an expensive hotel, but the way they always preferred, away from the noise, away from screens, just the 2 of them and the trees. The Gifford Pinchot National Forest had been on their list for years. Sarah had shown Mark pictures online. Vast stretches of old-growth timber, hidden waterfalls, trails that wound through moss-covered valleys where the air smelled like rain and cedar. She had been the one to suggest it. Mark, ever the planner, had mapped out the route, printed directions to a trailhead near Dark Meadow, checked the weather forecast 3 times. Clear skies, highs in the low 60s. Perfect conditions. By 8 in the morning, they were on the road. Sarah took a photo at a gas station just outside Portland, a selfie of the 2 of them grinning in the front seats, Mark's hand on the wheel, her head tilted against his shoulder. She posted it to Facebook with a caption that read, "5 years with my favorite human, here's to getting lost in the woods together." Friends commented almost immediately, heart emojis, inside jokes. Someone wrote, "Don't get too lost." Sarah replied with a laughing emoji. It was the last post she would ever make. Mark and Sarah Chen were not the kind of people who vanished. They were ordinary in the best possible way. Mark was 32, a software engineer at a mid-sized tech company in Portland. His coworkers described him as reliable, the kind of guy who never missed a deadline, who stayed late to help debug someone else's code, who kept his desk organized and his calendar color-coded. He was quiet, thoughtful, the type who listened more than he spoke. Sarah, 31, taught high school art at a public school in southeast Portland. Her students adored her. She had a way of making even the most disengaged teenager care about perspective, about shading, about seeing the world differently. Her classroom walls were covered in student work, bright splashes of color and emotion. She was warm, quick to laugh, the kind of person who remembered birthdays and brought homemade cookies to staff meetings. They had met 7 years earlier at a mutual friend's barbecue. Mark had been standing awkwardly by the grill, nursing a beer he didn't really want, when Sarah walked up and started talking to him about the most random thing, whether hot dogs were technically sandwiches. It was absurd and charming, and exactly the kind of icebreaker that worked on someone like Mark, who overthought everything. They talked for 2 hours. He asked for her number before he left. Their first date was a hike in Forest Park. Their second was a quiet dinner at a Thai restaurant, where they discovered they both loved the same obscure indie band. By the 3rd date, Mark's friends were already joking that he was going to marry her. He did, 2 years later, in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside the city. Sarah wore a simple white dress. Mark cried during his vows. Everyone said they were perfect together, and they were. Not perfect in the unrealistic social media kind of way, but perfect in the sense that they fit. They balanced each other. Mark's careful planning complemented Sarah's spontaneity. Her warmth softened his reserve. They finished each other's sentences, laughed at inside jokes no one else understood, spent weekends hiking or cooking elaborate meals or binge-watching terrible reality TV in comfortable silence. They talked about having kids someday, maybe buying a house with a backyard, growing old together. They were building a life, the kind of life that felt solid and real and safe. Which is why, when they didn't come home on Sunday night, it felt wrong immediately. Sarah's younger sister Emily was the first to notice. Sarah had texted her Friday afternoon, just before they left cell service. "Heading into the woods. Love you. See you Sunday night. Don't burn the house down." It was typical Sarah, affectionate and teasing. Emily had replied with a string of emojis and thought nothing of it. Sunday evening came and went. Emily figured they were running late, caught in traffic, maybe stopped for dinner on the way back. But by 10 o'clock, when Sarah still hadn't called or texted, Emily felt the first flicker of unease. She sent a text. No response. She called. Straight to voicemail. Monday morning, Emily called Mark's phone. Voicemail again. She told herself not to panic. Maybe they decided to stay an extra day. Maybe their phones died. Maybe they were out of service. But Sarah had work Monday morning. She never missed work without calling in. Emily tried Sarah's school. The front desk said she hadn't shown up, hadn't called. Emily's stomach dropped. She called Mark's office. Same story. He hadn't coming in. New email, new message. By noon, Emily was calling hospitals, checking accident reports online, scrolling through Sarah's social media for any clue she might have missed. Nothing. Just that last photo from Friday morning, the two of them smiling in the car, heading toward the forest. By Monday evening, Emily couldn't ignore the dread anymore. She called the Skamania County Sheriff's Office and reported Mark and Sarah missing. The dispatcher asked the standard questions. When did she last hear from them? Where were they going? Did they have any medical conditions, any history of mental illness, any reason to disappear intentionally? Emily answered as calmly as she could, but her voice cracked when she said, "They were just going camping. They were supposed to come home." The dispatcher assured her they would look into it, told her to stay by her phone, told her not to worry yet. People got delayed all the time. Cell service was spotty in the mountains. They would probably turn up soon, but Emily knew. She didn't know what had happened, but she knew something was terribly, horribly wrong. Sarah would never do this. She would never make people worry like this. Mark would never just disappear without telling someone. They were responsible, predictable, careful. They weren't the type to take unnecessary risks, or wander off trail, or ignore common sense. Emily spent that night on her couch, her phone clutched in her hand, staring at the screen, willing it to light up with Sarah's name. It never did. Tuesday morning, the reality began to sink in. The sheriff's office started making calls. They contacted the U.S. Forest Service, got a list of trailheads in the area Sarah had mentioned. They reached out to campground hosts, asked if anyone remembered seeing a silver Honda CR-V or a couple matching Mark and Sarah's description. No one did. They checked Mark's credit card activity. The last charge was Friday morning at that gas station outside Portland, the same one from Sarah's photo. Nothing after that. No hotel stays, no restaurant purchases, no gas fill-ups. They checked Sarah's bank account. Same thing. The last ATM withdrawal had been Thursday afternoon. $50. Grocery money. Mark's parents drove up from Eugene on Tuesday night. They were in their late 60s, retired school teachers who had always been proud of their quiet, successful son. His mother was frantic, her hands shaking as she showed investigators photos of Mark on her phone, as if they needed proof he was real. His father was stoic, the way men of his generation often were, but his eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. They kept asking the same questions. Where could they be? Why hasn't anyone seen them? What are you doing to find them? The answers were never enough. Sarah's mother flew in from California on Wednesday. She was a widow, Sarah's father having passed away from cancer 3 years earlier. Sarah was her only daughter, her best friend, the person she talked to every single day. She looked like she had aged a decade in the span of a weekend. Emily met her at the airport, and they held each other in the baggage claim and cried, surrounded by strangers pulling suitcases and checking their phones. Neither of them said it out loud, But they both felt it. The suffocating weight of not knowing. The helplessness. The creeping certainty that the people they loved were somewhere out there, unreachable, and there was nothing they could do but wait. By Wednesday afternoon, the sheriff's office had enough information to escalate. This wasn't just a delayed return. This was a missing persons case. Mark and Sarah Chen had entered the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest on Friday, September 27th, and they had never come out. Somewhere in that vast expanse of trees and rivers and mountains, they had vanished without a trace. And as the hours turned into days, the chances of finding them alive were dropping with every passing minute. The forest, indifferent and ancient, kept its silence. And somewhere deep within its shadows, a silver Honda CR-V sat waiting in the dark, already beginning to disappear beneath the moss and roots, as if the earth itself was trying to erase what had happened. But it would take 10 years before anyone found it. 10 years before the first piece of the nightmare finally surfaced. And by then, it would be far too late for answers to matter. The call went out at dawn on Thursday, October 3rd, 2013, 6 days after Mark and Sarah Chen had driven into the forest and failed to return. Skamania County Search and Rescue mobilized with the kind of urgency reserved for cases where time was the enemy. The weather was still holding, clear skies and moderate temperatures, but everyone knew the window was closing. Nights in the Gifford-Pinchot dropped into the 30s by late September. If Mark and Sarah were injured, lost, or stranded, every hour mattered. The forest was unforgiving. It didn't care about hope or prayers or how much someone was loved. It simply existed, vast and indifferent, swallowing sound and light, and people with equal ease. The first teams deployed to the trailheads near Dark Meadow, the area Sarah had mentioned in her text to Emily. It was a popular spot during the summer, but by late September, traffic thinned out. The parking area was empty when searchers arrived. No silver Honda CR-V, no signs of recent activity. They spread out, moving in grid patterns through the forest, calling Mark and Sarah's names, listening for responses that never came. The terrain was brutal, thick underbrush, fallen logs slick with moss, ravines hidden beneath layers of ferns. Visibility was limited to a few dozen feet in any direction. The canopy above filtered the sunlight into a dim, greenish haze that made everything look the same. It was easy to see how someone could get disoriented out here. Easy to see how someone could take a wrong turn and never find their way back. By midday Thursday, helicopters joined the search. They flew low over the forest, scanning for any sign of a campsite, a vehicle, bright-colored gear, anything that didn't belong. The pilots reported back the same thing over and over. Trees. Nothing but trees. The forest was too dense, the canopy too thick. Even if Mark and Sarah were down there, even if they were waving and shouting, the chances of spotting them from the air were slim. The helicopters continued their sweeps anyway, because what else could they do? Hope was all they had. K-9 units arrived by Friday. Bloodhounds trained to track human scent, their handlers experienced and methodical. They started at the Dark Meadow trailhead, working outward in expanding circles. The dogs picked up faint trails here and there, following scent paths that led to dead ends. A fallen tree, a creek bed, a rocky outcrop. The trails were old, contaminated by other hikers, other animals, the passage of days. The handlers tried starting points at other trailheads, other access roads. The results were the same: no sustained trail, no direction. It was as if Mark and Sarah had never been there at all. Volunteers started showing up over the weekend. Friends of the family, co-workers, strangers who had seen the story on the news and felt compelled to help. They formed lines and walked through the forest, shoulder to shoulder, eyes scanning the ground for any clue. A piece of fabric, a dropped item, footprints, anything. They found nothing. The community response was overwhelming and heartbreaking in equal measure. People brought food for the searchers. Local churches organized prayer vigils. Sarah's students made posters with her photo, bright and smiling, the word "missing" in bold letters underneath. Emily and Mark's parents distributed flyers at every gas station, every trailhead, every campground within 50 miles. Mark's face stared out from telephone poles and bulletin boards, his expression serious and kind. Sarah's smile seemed to follow people wherever they went, a reminder that these were real human beings, not just names on a missing persons report. But as the days wore on, the search revealed a troubling pattern, or rather, the absence of a pattern. There were no breadcrumbs to follow, no trail of evidence. Mark and Sarah's car, the silver 2009 Honda CR-V that should have been parked at a trailhead somewhere, was nowhere to be found. Investigators checked every parking area, every pullout, every access point in a 50-mile radius. They contacted campground hosts at nearby sites. They reviewed logs from Forest Service stations. They sent officers to knock on doors at remote cabins and ranger outposts. Did you see this couple? Did you see this vehicle? The answer was always no. It was as if the car had driven into the forest and ceased to exist. The technology wasn't helping either. Mark and Sarah's cell phones had pinged off a tower near Trout Lake on Friday afternoon, around 2 o'clock. After that, nothing. The phones either lost signal or were turned off. Investigators couldn't tell which. They subpoenaed records, analyzed patterns, triangulated the last known location. It gave them a general area, but the margin of error was miles in every direction. The forest didn't care about cell towers or GPS coordinates. It operated on its own terms. Credit card records were equally unhelpful. The last transaction was that Friday morning gas station purchase in Portland. After that, Mark and Sarah hadn't used their cards anywhere. No food stops, new gear purchases, new emergency hotel stays. Investigators considered every possibility. Had they withdrawn cash earlier and were using that? Possibly. But Sarah's last ATM transaction was Thursday, $50, hardly enough for an extended trip. Had they met someone in the forest? Someone who harmed them? There was no evidence of foul play, no witnesses, no suspicious activity reported in the area. Had they planned to disappear? Friends and family were adamant that was impossible. Mark and Sarah were happy, stable. They had jobs they cared about, people who loved them, a life they were actively building. Running away made no sense. Detectives interviewed everyone in their lives. Co-workers described Mark as dependable and well-liked, if a bit reserved. Sarah's fellow teachers and students spoke of her warmth, her creativity, her dedication. Friends described the couple as inseparable, the kind of pair who still held hands in public after 5 years of marriage. There were no reports of arguments, no financial troubles, no secrets. Their apartment, searched with Emily's permission, revealed nothing unusual. Bills paid on time, a refrigerator stocked with groceries, a calendar on the wall with "anniversary trip" written in Sarah's handwriting on September 27. Everything pointed to two people who had every intention of coming home. By the end of the second week, the active search began to wind down. It wasn't a decision anyone wanted to make, but resources were finite. The initial push helicopters, K-9 units, dozens of volunteers was unsustainable. The forest was too big. Over 1.3 million acres of wilderness, much of it roadless and rugged. The search had covered the most likely areas, the logical places someone would go if they were trying to reach help. They had found nothing. Not a footprint, not a piece of torn clothing. Not a single indication that Mark and Sarah had ever set foot in those woods. The official search was scaled back to periodic sweeps, focused checks of high-probability areas, and reliance on tips from the public. The case remained open, but the energy shifted. The urgency faded. The helicopters stopped flying. The volunteers went back to their lives. The news crews moved on to other stories. And Emily was left standing at the edge of the forest, staring into the trees, knowing her sister was in there somewhere but having no idea where to even begin looking. She refused to give up. She couldn't. Giving up meant accepting that Sarah was gone, and Emily wasn't ready to do that. She organized search parties on weekends, recruiting anyone willing to hike into the woods and look. She maintained a Facebook page, posting updates, sharing articles, pleading for information. She appeared on local news stations, her face pale and exhausted, her voice trembling as she begged anyone with knowledge to come forward. Mark's parents did interviews too, holding hands as they spoke about their son, their voices breaking when they said his name. Sarah's mother couldn't bring herself to appear on camera. She stayed home, surrounded by photos of her daughter, waiting for a phone call that never came. Tips trickled in sporadically. Someone thought they saw a couple matching their description near a different trailhead the weekend they disappeared. Investigators followed up. It wasn't them. A hunter claimed he found a campsite that looked recently abandoned. Search teams checked it out. It belonged to someone else entirely. A woman called to say she had a psychic vision of water and trees and a feeling of cold. Detectives thanked her and filed the report away. They couldn't afford to ignore anything, but most leads went nowhere. 1 month after Mark and Sarah vanished, the case was officially classified as cold. The active investigation stopped. The file went into a drawer. Detectives moved on to newer cases, ones with leads and evidence, and some chance of resolution. Emily felt the shift immediately. The phone calls from investigators became less frequent. The updates stopped. When she called the sheriff's office, she could hear the sympathy in their voices, but also the resignation. They were sorry. They were still looking. But there was nothing new to report. The forest had swallowed Mark and Sarah Chen whole, and as the weeks turned into months, as autumn gave way to winter and the first snow blanketed the Gifford Pinchot, it became harder and harder to believe they would ever be found. The wilderness had taken them, and it wasn't giving them back. Not yet. Not for a very, very long time. But somewhere, deep in a ravine hidden from view, beneath a tangle of roots and moss and thyme, a silver Honda CR-V sat waiting in the darkness, waiting for someone to find it, waiting to reveal the first piece of a mystery that would haunt a family for 10 years. In the months and years that followed, Mark and Sarah Chen's disappearance became a story people told, a cautionary tale whispered around campfires and dissected in online forums. It had all the elements of a mystery that captured attention: young, attractive couple, loving relationship, inexplicable vanishing, no evidence. True crime enthusiasts latched onto it. Threads appeared on Reddit, multi-page discussions analyzing every detail. Armchair detectives pored over timelines, scrutinized the last known photo, speculated endlessly about what might have happened. Theories ranged from the plausible to the absurd, each one reflecting the bias of whoever proposed it. The most common theory was the simplest. Mark and Sarah got lost. They ventured off trail, became disoriented, and succumbed to exposure. The Gifford Pinchot was notorious for that kind of tragedy. Every year, hikers underestimated the terrain, overestimated their abilities, and paid the price. The forest was deceptive. Trails that looked straightforward on a map could twist into confusing networks of game paths and dead ends. Cell service was unreliable. Weather could turn in minutes. If Mark and Sarah had taken a wrong turn, if darkness had fallen before they realized their mistake, if one of them had been injured, it was entirely possible they never made it out. The fact that their bodies hadn't been found wasn't unusual. The forest was vast. Animals scattered remains. Vegetation grew over everything. People could lie undiscovered for decades in terrain like that. But others weren't convinced. Why hadn't their car been found? If they parked at a trailhead and went hiking, the vehicle should have been sitting there, waiting. The fact that it wasn't suggested something else had happened. Maybe they drove down a logging road, got stuck, and tried to hike out. Maybe they had car trouble and were stranded. Maybe they took a wrong turn on the way to the trailhead and ended up somewhere completely different. Investigators had checked the obvious places, but the Gifford Pinchot had hundreds of miles of old, overgrown roads, many of them unmapped and rarely traveled. It was possible the car was out there, hidden by forest growth, missed by search efforts. Then there were the darker theories. Foul play. Maybe Mark and Sarah had encountered someone in the woods. A drifter, a violent stranger, someone who harmed them and hid the evidence. The Pacific Northwest had a history of violent crimes in remote areas. Cases where hikers or campers disappeared and were later found murdered. It wasn't common, but it happened. The problem with this theory was the complete absence of evidence. No reports of suspicious individuals in the area, no signs of struggle, no witnesses. If someone had harmed Mark and Sarah, they had done so without leaving a single trace. Some people went even further. Conspiracy theories surfaced. Maybe Mark and Sarah had stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see. Illegal logging, drug operations, human trafficking. The forest was remote, isolated, the kind of place where illegal activity could happen unnoticed. Maybe they witnessed something and were silenced. Maybe their car was hidden on purpose. Maybe the lack of evidence wasn't an accident but a cover-up. These theories gained little traction outside the darkest corners of the internet, but they persisted, fed by the absence of answers. And then there was the theory that made Emily's blood boil every time she saw it. Maybe they ran away. Maybe Mark and Sarah staged their own disappearance to escape their lives and start over somewhere new. Proponents of this idea pointed to the lack of bodies, the missing car, the complete absence of evidence. If they had died in the forest, something should have been found by now. The fact that nothing had turned up suggested they didn't want to be found. Emily knew this was nonsense. She knew her sister. Sarah would never do that to her family. She would never put her mother, her students, her friends through this kind of agony. Mark was the same. He was responsible, loyal, grounded. The idea that they abandoned their entire lives, that they were out there somewhere living under fake names, was insulting and cruel. But the theory wouldn't die. It lingered in comment sections and message boards, a constant reminder that strangers felt entitled to speculate about people they'd never met. Tips came in sporadically over the years, each one a small spike of hope, followed by crushing disappointment. In June 2014, a hiker reported seeing a couple matching Mark and Sarah's description near Dark Meadow Trail. The hiker remembered because they seemed underdressed for the weather, wearing light jackets and carrying minimal gear. Search teams deployed to the area again. They combed the trails, checked nearby campsites, interviewed other hikers. They found nothing. Follow-up questioning revealed the hiker's memory was fuzzy on dates and details. It might not have even been the same weekend. The lead evaporated. In November 2015, a psychic contacted Emily directly through the Facebook page. The woman claimed to have visions, flashes of images that she believed were connected to Sarah. She described water, moss-covered rocks, a feeling of cold and darkness. She said Sarah was trying to communicate that she was near water but not in it. Emily was skeptical but desperate. She forwarded the information to investigators, who noted it in the file but didn't act on it. Psychic tips rarely led anywhere. Still, Emily found herself thinking about it, wondering if there was something to it, hating herself for even considering it. In March 2017, a skull was discovered by a mushroom forager about 40 miles north of where Mark and Sarah were believed to have entered the forest. The discovery made regional news. Could this be one of them? Dental records were compared. The skull belonged to someone else entirely, a man who had been missing since the 1,990 seconds. His family finally got closure. Emily felt guilty for the flash of relief she experienced when the skull wasn't Sarah's, as if hoping for answers meant wishing suffering on another family. The psychological toll on Emily was immense. Her life became defined by the search. She quit her job to focus on finding her sister, burning through savings, taking on freelance work just to pay rent. Her marriage, already strained by the obsession, fell apart in 2016. Her husband loved her, but he couldn't compete with a ghost. Every conversation circled back to Sarah. Every weekend was spent in the forest. Every notification on her phone made her jump, hoping for news. He tried to be supportive, but eventually, he couldn't watch her destroy herself anymore. They divorced quietly, amicably, both of them exhausted. Every year on the anniversary, Emily returned to the forest. September 27th became a ritual, a day of pilgrimage. She would drive to the trailheads, park where search teams had parked years earlier, and walk into the trees. She called their names until her voice was hoarse. She left flowers at the Dark Meadow trailhead, though she had no idea if they had ever been there. She walked until her feet bled, until dusk forced her back to her car, until she was so tired she could barely drive home. She posted updates on the Facebook page, memorializing the day they disappeared, sharing photos, begging for anyone with information to come forward. The posts got fewer likes each year. People moved on. Emily couldn't. Mark's parents aged rapidly. His father developed a heart condition, stress-induced and worsening. His mother stopped sleeping through the night, waking up at 3 a.m. to check her phone, convinced she had missed a call. They attended vigils. They gave interviews. They held on to hope with a fierceness that was painful to witness. But the hope was hollow, brittle, a thing they clung to because the alternative was unbearable. They never said the word dead out loud. They talked about Mark in the present tense. They kept his childhood bedroom exactly as he left it. They waited for him to come home. Sarah's mother deteriorated the fastest. She had lost her husband 3 years before losing her daughter, and the compounding grief was too much. She stopped eating properly, stopped seeing friends, stopped doing anything except stare at photos and cry. Emily tried to help, but there was nothing she could do. Her mother needed Sarah, and Sarah was gone. In August 2019, Sarah's mother passed away from pneumonia, her body too weak to fight it off. At the funeral, Emily stood beside the casket and thought about how her mother had died without ever knowing what happened to her daughter. The injustice of it, the cruelty, was suffocating. She buried her mother next to her father, and on the headstone she had Sarah's name added beneath theirs. Not a death date, just her name, a placeholder for closure that might never come. The case file gathered dust. The lead detective, a man named Tom Hargrove, who had spent hundreds of hours on the investigation, retired in 2018. He apologized to Emily at his retirement party, tears in his eyes, saying he wished he could have done more. His replacement inherited the case along with a dozen others, all of them cold, all of them impossible. The new detective was professional and sympathetic, but Emily could tell the case wasn't a priority. There were no leads, no new information, just a tragic mystery that had been picked over for years with nothing to show for it. The story faded from public consciousness. Local news stopped covering it. The Facebook page became quieter, fewer updates, fewer shares. Mark and Sarah Chen became another name on a long list of people who walked into the Pacific Northwest wilderness and never came out. They joined the ranks of the missing, the lost, the disappeared. Their faces appeared in databases and on websites dedicated to unsolved cases. But to most people, they were just another sad story, a reminder to be careful in the woods. But Emily never stopped. She couldn't. Sarah was her sister, her best friend, the person she had grown up with, fought with, laughed with, loved. Mark was family. They deserved to be found. They deserved to be brought home. So Emily kept searching, kept posting, kept hoping. Even as the years piled up and the chances of finding them alive dwindled to nothing. She walked the same trails over and over, her eyes scanning the forest floor, looking for something, anything, that would tell her what happened. The forest remained silent. It kept its secrets close, buried beneath layers of moss and thyme. And somewhere, deep in a ravine no one had thought to check, a silver Honda CR-V sat in the dark, roots winding through its windows, nature slowly erasing it from existence. 10 years would pass before anyone found it. 10 years of waiting, searching, grieving, hoping. 10 years of Emily walking through the trees, calling names that echoed unanswered. The forest remembered. It always remembered. But it wasn't ready to give up its dead. Not yet. October 2023 arrived cold and wet, the kind of autumn that reminded people why the Pacific Northwest had a reputation for gloom. The rain started early that year, turning trails to mud, swelling creeks, draping the forest in a constant mist that made everything look distant and unreal. Most hikers stayed home. The trails were empty. The forest belonged to the rangers and the wildlife, the way it always did when the weather turned. Jake Holloway and Mia Torres were two of those rangers. They had been with the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest Service for years, long enough to know the land, to respect it, to understand that it could be beautiful and deadly in equal measure. On October 15th, they were conducting a routine survey in a remote section of the forest, an area far from established trails, accessible only by overgrown logging roads that hadn't seen vehicle traffic in decades. They were documenting illegal logging activity, a persistent problem in remote areas where people assumed no one was watching. The timber companies had long since abandoned these roads, but poachers still came through, cutting down old-growth trees under cover of darkness and hauling them out before anyone noticed. Jake and Mia hiked in on foot, carrying GPS units and cameras, marking coordinates where trees had been felled illegally. The terrain was brutal, thick underbrush, fallen logs, ravines hidden beneath ferns and moss, the kind of place where you watched every step, where a twisted ankle could mean a long, painful hike out. They were deep in the survey, maybe 3 miles from the nearest drivable road, when Jake stopped abruptly. Mia almost walked into him. "You see that?" Jake asked, pointing. Mia followed his gaze. At first, she didn't see anything unusual. Just more trees, more undergrowth, more of the same dense forest they'd been walking through all morning. Then she noticed it, a glint of metal, barely visible beneath a tangle of roots and moss. It was too symmetrical to be natural, too smooth. Metal didn't belong out here, not like that. They approached carefully, stepping over logs and pushing aside ferns. The closer they got, the stranger it looked. The metal was part of something larger, something buried beneath years of forest growth. Jake knelt down and started pulling away moss, his hands working carefully. Mia joined him. Within minutes, they had uncovered enough to see what it was: a vehicle, or what was left of one. The roof of a car, completely engulfed by the forest, sitting in a shallow ravine about 30 feet below the old logging road. "Jesus," Mia breathed. Jake pulled out his radio. "We need to call this in." They spent the next hour clearing more vegetation, trying to get a better look without disturbing what was clearly a potential crime scene. The car was a mid-sized SUV, silver beneath the grime and moss. Tree roots had grown through the windows, winding around the interior like something out of a nightmare. Moss carpeted every surface, thick and green, turning the vehicle into part of the landscape. It looked ancient, like something that had been there for decades, not years. The forest had claimed it, absorbed it, made it part of itself. Mia climbed down into the ravine, moving carefully on the steep slope. She wiped away moss from the rear bumper, looking for a license plate. It was there, barely readable, the numbers and letters obscured by dirt and corrosion. She read them aloud to Jake, who wrote them down. He radioed it in to dispatch, gave their coordinates, explained what they had found. The dispatcher's voice crackled back, professional but laced with something else. Urgency, maybe, or disbelief. "Stand by, we're sending units." Within 2 hours, the site was swarmed. Sheriff's deputies, forensic techs, cadaver dogs, and their handlers. A team from the medical examiner's office. The coordinator from search and rescue, a woman named Linda who had been involved in dozens of missing persons cases over the years. Linda stood at the edge of the ravine, staring down at the car, her expression unreadable. "How long has this been here?" someone asked. "Hard to say," Linda replied. "Could be years, could be a decade." One of the forensic techs climbed down with Jake's help, carrying a camera and evidence markers. He started photographing the vehicle from every angle, documenting the scene before anyone touched anything. Another tech ran the license plate through the database. The response came back within minutes. The car was registered to Mark Chen, reported missing in September 2013. The words hung in the air like a physical thing, heavy and suffocating. 10 years. The car had been sitting here for 10 years, hidden from view, missed by every search effort, every helicopter sweep, every desperate attempt to find them. Linda felt her chest tighten. She had been part of the original search. She remembered Mark and Sarah's faces on the missing posters. She remembered Emily, frantic and exhausted, begging for help. And now, here it was, the first real evidence in a decade. But finding the car wasn't the same as finding them. And as she looked at the roots growing through the windows, the moss covering every surface, she felt a deep, cold dread about what they were going to find inside. The decision was made to extract the vehicle as carefully as possible. It would take time. The ravine was steep, the car was embedded in the hillside, and the roots had to be cut away without destroying potential evidence. They brought in equipment, set up a perimeter, established a command post at the logging road above. News spread fast. By evening, reporters were gathering at the access points, cameras ready, trying to get a glimpse of the scene. The sheriff's office issued a brief statement. A vehicle matching the description of the Chen's missing car had been located. The investigation was ongoing. No further details at this time. Emily got the call at 6 in the evening. She was at home, finishing a freelance project, trying not to think about the fact that it was October again. The anniversary month, the time of year that always dragged her back into the worst memories. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. It was a detective from the Skamania County Sheriff's Office. Not the detective she had dealt with for years, but someone new, someone whose voice she didn't recognize. He asked if she was sitting down. Emily's heart stopped. "We found the car," he said. Emily didn't remember the rest of the conversation. She remembered the room spinning, the phone slipping from her hand, the sound of her own voice screaming without meaning to. Neighbors heard and came running. They found her on the floor, sobbing, incoherent, clutching her phone. Someone called an ambulance. Emily refused to go. She needed to get to the forest. She needed to see it. They had found the car. After 10 years, they had found the car. But what did that mean? Were Mark and Sarah inside? Were they alive? Were they dead? Were they somewhere else? The detective hadn't said, or maybe he had, and Emily hadn't been able to process it. She didn't know. She couldn't think. Mark's parents were notified next. His father answered the phone, listened in silence, and then sat down heavily on the couch. His mother watched him, her face going pale. When he told her, she started crying, deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place of 10 years of held breath, 10 years of waiting, 10 years of not knowing. They held each other and cried and didn't know whether to feel hope or despair. The media descended. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. Local news, national outlets, true crime websites. Social media exploded with theories and speculation. People who had followed the case from the beginning felt vindicated. People who had never heard of Mark and Sarah Chen suddenly knew their names. The forest, indifferent for so long, was suddenly the center of attention, and deep in that ravine, surrounded by investigators and cameras and the weight of a decade's worth of questions, a silver Honda CR-V sat waiting to reveal its secrets. Extracting the car took 3 full days. Crews worked methodically, cutting away roots, stabilizing the vehicle, documenting every step. The forest resisted, as if reluctant to give up what it had hidden for so long. But slowly, carefully, they freed the car from the earth. They loaded it onto a flatbed truck and transported it to a secure facility where forensic teams could examine it properly, away from the elements and the prying eyes of the media. Emily stood at the edge of the ravine on the 3rd day, watching them pull the car out. She had driven to the site as soon as they let her through the perimeter, needing to see it with her own eyes. The car looked like something from another world, covered in moss and roots, more organic than mechanical. It didn't look real. None of this felt real. She stood there until the car was gone, until the flatbed truck disappeared down the logging road, until there was nothing left but the empty ravine and the forest closing in around it. She thought about Sarah, about Mark, about the fact that they had been here all along, so close to where searchers had been, just hidden by chance and terrain and the relentless growth of the forest. 10 years. She had walked past this spot, maybe not directly but close enough that if she had veered a few hundred feet in a different direction, she might have found them. The thought was unbearable. She had been so close, they all had, and yet not close enough, never close enough. The question everyone was asking now was the same question Emily couldn't stop thinking about. If the car had been here for 10 years, where were Mark and Sarah? Were they inside? Were they nearby? Or had they survived the crash and walked away, only to die somewhere else in the forest, their remains scattered and lost? The car was just the beginning, the first piece of a puzzle that might never be complete, and as Emily stood alone in the fading light, staring at the empty ravine, she realized that finding the car wasn't closure. It was just the start of a new kind of nightmare. The forensic examination began on October 19, 2023, in a climate-controlled facility 40 miles from the recovery site. The silver Honda CR-V sat under bright lights, still covered in moss and dirt, roots trailing from the broken windows like the forest was reluctant to let it go. A team of specialists surrounded it, cameras documenting every angle before anyone touched anything. This wasn't just evidence. This was the culmination of a decade-long mystery, and every detail mattered. The first priority was determining whether human remains were inside. Cadaver dogs had alerted at the site, but the signals were inconclusive, contaminated by time and the organic material that had infiltrated the vehicle. The team worked slowly, carefully removing vegetation from the exterior, cutting away roots that had grown through the window frames and door seams. It took hours just to clear enough growth to safely open the doors. When they finally did, the interior was revealed in all its haunting detail. No bodies. That was the first and most significant finding. The driver's seat and passenger seat were empty. No skeletal remains. No decomposed tissue. No indication that Mark and Sarah had died inside the vehicle. For a brief moment, that absence felt like hope. But hope was complicated. If they weren't in the car, where were they? The front seats showed clear signs of occupancy. The driver's seat was pushed back, consistent with someone around Mark's height, 5'11". The passenger seat was adjusted forward. more consistent with Sarah, who was 5'4". Both seatbelts were unbuckled, hanging loose against the seats. The driver's side door was partially open, jammed by roots, but clearly ajar when the forest had begun growing around it. The passenger door was closed, but not locked. Then there was the blood. Not a lot, but enough to tell a story. Dried streaks on the dashboard, brownish and faint after 10 years of exposure, a smear on the steering wheel, a few drops on the driver's side seat. Forensic techs collected samples carefully, sealing them in evidence bags for DNA analysis. The preliminary assessment was that the blood was human, likely from minor trauma, a cut, a nosebleed, maybe a head injury from the crash. Not enough to suggest fatal wounds, but enough to indicate someone had been hurt. The forensic team moved methodically through the rest of the vehicle. In the back seat, they found a waterlogged backpack, its contents fused together by moisture and time. Inside were layers of soggy fabric, the remnants of clothing, and what looked like a first aid kit, unopened. The trunk held camping gear, still neatly packed, a two-person tent in its carrying bag, 2 sleeping bags, rolled and secured with straps, a Coleman stove, a cooler, its contents long since decomposed into black sludge. Everything you would expect a couple to bring on a weekend camping trip. Everything that suggested they never made it to their campsite. Sarah's art supplies were in a canvas bag on the floor of the back seat. Sketchbooks with pages warped and stuck together. Pencils and charcoal sticks scattered loose. A small watercolor set, the paints dried into hard, unusable lumps. One of the sketchbooks was partially intact, and a forensic tech carefully separated the pages, hoping for something, a note maybe, or a clue. Most pages were illegible. The ink bled into abstract smears. But one page, protected by the pages around it, showed a partial sketch. Trees, a horizon line, Sarah's distinctive style, loose and expressive. It might have been a drawing of the forest they were about to enter. Or maybe just a doodle. There was no way to know. They found Sarah's phone wedged between the passenger seat and the center console. The screen was shattered, the device waterlogged and inoperable. Mark's phone was in the cup holder, in similar condition. Both phones were sent to a digital forensics lab with instructions to extract any recoverable data. The chances were slim. 10 years of moisture and temperature fluctuations had likely destroyed the internal components, but they had to try. The vehicle itself told a more complete story. The front bumper was crumpled, damage consistent with a collision or impact. The undercarriage showed scraping, deep gouges where the car had dragged over rocks or logs. The tires were flat, the rubber cracked and degraded. Forensic engineers examined the damage patterns and reconstructed the sequence of events. The car had been traveling on the old logging road, likely in low visibility or darkness. It had veered off the road, possibly to avoid something or due to driver error, and gone over the edge of the ravine. The slope was steep but not vertical, and the car had rolled approximately 30 feet before coming to rest against a cluster of old-growth trees. The trees had stopped the car from rolling further, possibly saving it from a more catastrophic crash. The damage was significant but not catastrophic. The front end was crumpled, the windshield cracked, but the passenger cabin was largely intact. Airbags had deployed, leaving deflated remnants hanging from the steering wheel and dashboard. The crash was survivable. Absolutely survivable. In fact, the evidence suggested Mark and Sarah had survived, had unbuckled their seatbelts, had opened the door and climbed out. The question was, what happened next? Detectives reconstructed the timeline as best they could. Mark and Sarah had entered the Gifford Pinchot on Friday, September 27, 2013. Their last cell phone ping was around 2 in the afternoon near Trout Lake. At some point after that, they drove down this remote logging road. Why? The road wasn't on any official map. It didn't lead to a trailhead or campground. It was overgrown, barely passable, the kind of place you only ended up if you were lost or took a wrong turn. Maybe their GPS had malfunctioned. Maybe they misread directions. Maybe they were trying to find a secluded spot to camp and thought this road led somewhere. Whatever the reason, they ended up here, driving in conditions that made the road dangerous. The crash likely happened Friday evening or night. The forest was dense, the canopy thick. Even in daylight, the logging road would have been difficult to navigate. At dusk or in darkness, it would have been nearly impossible. One wrong turn, a moment of distraction, and the car went over. They rolled down the ravine, came to a stop, and the airbags deployed. Shaken, maybe injured, but alive. The blood on the dashboard suggested at least one of them had sustained a head injury, but nothing life-threatening. They unbuckled. They opened the door. They got out. And then what? That was the question investigators couldn't answer. Logic suggested they would have tried to hike back to the logging road, to climb out of the ravine and find their way to civilization. But the forest at night was disorienting. Visibility was almost zero. Without a flashlight, without a clear sense of direction, it would have been easy to get turned around. And if they were injured, if adrenaline was the only thing keeping them moving, they might have made poor decisions, might have walked in the wrong direction, might have gone deeper into the wilderness instead of toward safety. Search teams remobilized. The discovery of the car gave them a starting point, something they hadn't had in 10 years. They focused on a 5-mile radius around the vehicle, deploying cadaver dogs, ground teams, and helicopters. The terrain was brutal, the same dense forest and ravines that had stymied the original search. But now they had a direction, a point of origin. If Mark and Sarah had tried to hike out, this was where they started. The cadaver dogs alerted in multiple locations over the next several days. Each alert triggered a careful excavation, technicians digging through layers of soil and vegetation, hoping and dreading what they might find. Most alerts turned out to be false positives, animal remains or organic material that mimicked the scent of human decomposition. But the dogs kept working, and the teams kept searching. Emily joined the searches, as she had so many times before. But this time was different. This time, she knew where they had been. She walked the ridges above the ravine, staring down at the spot where the car had sat for 10 years. She tried to imagine what Sarah had been thinking, tried to picture her sister climbing out of the wrecked vehicle, disoriented and scared, trying to figure out which way to go. The thought was unbearable. Sarah had been here, right here, and Emily had never found her. The psychological weight of proximity was crushing. Emily had walked these forests for years, had covered hundreds of miles of trails, had called Sarah's name into the void over and over, and all that time, Sarah had been within a few miles, hidden by terrain and chance. If the original search had gone just a little further east, if the helicopters had flown a slightly different pattern, if the K-9 units had picked up the scent trail before rain washed it away, they might have found them. They had been so close. But close didn't matter. Close meant nothing if you didn't find them. Days turned into weeks. The searches continued, methodical and exhausting. Volunteers walked grid patterns through the forest, their eyes scanning the ground for anything unusual. A piece of fabric, a bone, a shoe, anything, they found nothing. The forest had kept Mark and Sarah hidden for 10 years. It didn't seem inclined to give them up now. Forensic analysis of the car continued in parallel. DNA testing confirmed the blood belonged to Mark. The samples were degraded, but there was enough to run a match. The blood on the passenger side of the dashboard was Sarah's. Both had been injured in the crash, but neither injury appeared fatal. The phones were sent to a specialized lab that worked with damaged devices, trying to recover data from the corroded circuit boards. After weeks of work, they managed to extract fragments. A few text messages from earlier that day. Part of Sarah's photo gallery. Timestamps that confirmed the phones had been active until late Friday afternoon. Then nothing. Either the batteries died, the phones were damaged in the crash, or they lost signal. There were no outgoing calls after the crash. No emergency texts, no final messages, just silence. The final piece of the puzzle was the journal found in Sarah's backpack. The pages were stuck together. The ink bled into illegibility. Forensic document examiners worked carefully to separate them, using humidity chambers and specialized tools. Most of the journal was unreadable, but a few lines on the last page were partially intact. Sarah's handwriting, the letters faint and smeared. The words that could be made out were simple, mundane, the kind of things someone writes when they're excited about a trip. So excited to be here with Mark. Beautiful. Can't wait to. The rest was gone, absorbed by water and time. It was heartbreaking in its ordinariness. Sarah had been happy. They had both been happy. This was supposed to be a celebration, an anniversary trip, a weekend to remember. And instead, it became the weekend they vanished. The weekend they drove down a wrong road, crashed into a ravine, and walked into the forest, never to be seen again. As October turned to November, the active searches began to wind down again. The initial surge of activity, the hope that finding the car would lead to finding them, faded into grim reality. The car was a piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't the answer. Mark and Sarah had survived the crash. They had walked away, and somewhere in the 1.3 million acres of wilderness, they had disappeared for good. Emily stood at the site one last time before winter closed in, snow already dusting the higher elevations, the forest preparing to hibernate. She looked at the empty ravine, at the place where the car had sat for so long, and she felt the weight of 10 years settle on her shoulders. They were out there, somewhere, and the forest was never going to tell her where. The snow came early that year, blanketing the Gifford Pinchot in white by mid-November. The searches stopped. The forest became impassable, trails buried under feet of powder, temperatures dropping below freezing. Search and rescue called it until spring, the way they always did. The forest didn't care about timelines or urgency. It operated on its own schedule, and winter was a time for stillness, for silence, for the living to retreat and leave the dead where they lay. Emily spent the winter in a kind of limbo. The discovery of the car had reignited the grief she had spent 10 years learning to carry. It had felt like progress, like forward momentum, like maybe, finally, they would get answers. But weeks had passed without finding Mark and Sarah, and the initial hope had curdled into something darker: frustration, anger, the unbearable weight of knowing they had been so close and yet still unreachable. She stopped updating the Facebook page, stopped responding to messages from reporters, stopped doing anything except existing in the hollow space between hope and acceptance. Then, in late December, a hiker found something. The man's name was Derek Shaw, a local who knew the Gifford Pinchot better than most. He had been hiking an unmarked trail near Canyon Creek, about 3 miles northeast of where the car had been found, when he noticed something wedged between 2 rocks at the creek bed. He thought it was trash at first, the kind of thing careless campers left behind. But as he got closer, he realized it was a boot. A hiking boot, weathered and faded, the laces rotted away, the leather cracked from years of exposure. Something about it felt wrong, out of place. He pulled it free and saw the sole was still intact, the tread visible despite the damage. There was something inside, not a foot, thank God, but the remnants of a sock, stiff and discolored. Derek called it in. Within hours, investigators were at the site, carefully documenting and collecting the boot. They sent it to the forensic lab with the same instructions as everything else: analyze, identify, report. The DNA testing took 3 weeks. The sample was degraded, the organic material broken down by moisture and time, but there was enough. The boot belonged to Mark Chen. The discovery was announced in a brief press release in mid-January 2024. Emily read it on her phone, sitting in her apartment, the lights off, the winter sun barely reaching through the curtains. She didn't cry. She had no tears left. She just stared at the screen, reading the words over and over, trying to make them mean something. They found his boot, 3 miles from the car. Mark had walked 3 miles, or part of him had. Was he alive when he lost it? Did he take it off? Did it come off in a fall? Was he injured? Was he alone? The questions spiraled, and there were no answers. Search teams returned to the area around Canyon Creek as soon as the snow began to melt in March. They focused on the creek bed, the surrounding slopes, anywhere Mark might have traveled from the car. The terrain was rugged, steep embankments and dense undergrowth, the kind of place where a fall could be fatal. They found nothing else, no more clothing, no remains, just that single boot, sitting in the creek for a decade, waiting to be discovered. Then, in April, another find. A volunteer searcher, a woman named Lisa Tran, who had been part of the original searches 10 years earlier, was combing a slope about half a mile south of the creek when she noticed fabric snagged on a low-hanging branch. The fabric was faded, torn, barely recognizable. She marked the location and called it in. Forensic techs collected the fragments carefully, sealing them in evidence bags. Analysis confirmed the material was consistent with Sarah's jacket, the one she had been wearing in the last known photo of her. 2 fragments, a boot and a piece of fabric. That was all the forest gave back. 2 tiny pieces of 2 people who had vanished a decade earlier. Investigators tried to build a narrative from the fragments. Mark and Sarah had survived the crash. They climbed out of the ravine and attempted to hike to safety. But they were disoriented, possibly injured, and they went the wrong direction, heading northeast and south, deeper into the wilderness instead of toward the logging road and civilization. The terrain was unforgiving. At night, temperatures in late September dropped into the 30s. Without proper gear, without shelter, hypothermia would set in within hours. The theory that emerged was grim but logical. Mark and Sarah had separated, either intentionally or by accident. Maybe they split up to cover more ground, each believing they could find help faster alone. Maybe one of them was too injured to continue and stayed behind while the other went for help. Maybe they simply lost each other in the dark, their voices swallowed by the forest, unable to find each other again. Whatever the reason, they went different directions. Mark headed northeast toward the creek. Sarah went south toward the embankment. Neither of them found their way out. In the wilderness, exposure kills quickly. Hypothermia doesn't announce itself with dramatic symptoms. It creeps in, a gradual shutdown of the body's systems. First comes the shivering, violent, and uncontrollable. Then confusion, disorientation, poor decision-making. Then the shivering stops, a sign that the body is conserving energy, shutting down non-essential functions. Then unconsciousness. Then death. In temperatures in the 30s, dressed in light camping clothes, injured and exhausted, Mark and Sarah wouldn't have lasted long. A few hours, maybe. Certainly not through the night. And once they succumbed, the forest took over. Animals scattered remains. Scavengers, from coyotes to ravens to insects, broke down organic material. Rain and snow accelerated decomposition. Vegetation grew over everything. Within months, there would be little left. Within years, nothing. Bones could last longer, but bones were small, easy to miss, easy to cover with leaves and moss and time. The forest was efficient. It recycled everything. It left nothing to waste. Emily understood the theory. She understood the science. She understood that Mark and Sarah were almost certainly dead, that they had died within hours or days of the crash, that their remains were scattered across the forest floor, too degraded and dispersed to ever be found. She understood all of it, and it didn't help. Because understanding wasn't the same as accepting, and accepting wasn't the same as closure. She held a memorial service in May 2024. Not a funeral, because there were no bodies to bury. Just a memorial, a gathering at the site where the car had been found. She invited family, friends, co-workers, anyone who had known Mark and Sarah. About 40 people came, standing in a clearing near the ravine, surrounded by trees, the air filled with the smell of moss and earth. Emily planted 2 trees, a cedar for Mark, strong and enduring, a birch for Sarah, graceful and bright. She dug the holes herself, refusing help, her hands covered in dirt, her back aching. She planted the saplings carefully, packing soil around the roots, whispering to them as she worked. She left a waterproof frame between the trees, Mark and Sarah's wedding photo inside, the two of them smiling, happy, alive. She placed stones around the base of the trees, small cairns to mark the spot. It wasn't a grave, but it was something, a place to come, a place to remember. People spoke. Mark's father, his voice breaking, talking about his son's kindness, his quiet strength, the way he made people feel safe. One of Sarah's students, now in college, talking about how Mrs. Chen had believed in her when no one else did, how she had encouraged her to apply to art school, how she still carried one of Sarah's sketches in her wallet. Emily spoke last, her voice steady despite the tears. She talked about Sarah's laugh, about the way she hummed when she was painting, about the 1,000 small moments that made up a life. She talked about Mark's terrible jokes, his methodical way of approaching problems, the way he looked at Sarah like she was the only person in the room. She talked about how unfair it was, how cruel, that 2 people who loved each other so much could just disappear. "I don't know if you can hear me," Emily said, her voice directed at the trees, at the forest, at the silence beyond. "But I hope you're together. I hope you weren't alone, and I hope you know we never stopped looking." The case officially remained open. That was the language the sheriff's office used. Open, but inactive. They would follow up on any new tips, any new discoveries, But the active investigation was over. The likelihood of finding remains was near zero. The forest was too vast, too wild. The detectives had done everything they could. Everyone had done everything they could. And it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Emily visited the memorial site every few months. She tended the trees, pulling weeds, adding stones, replacing the photo when the frame showed signs of wear. She sat between the cedar and the birch and talked to Sarah, telling her about her life, about the things she missed, about how the world had changed in 10 years. She told Mark about his parents, how his father's heart was failing, how his mother still set a place for him at Thanksgiving. She cried sometimes, but not always. Sometimes she just sat in silence, listening to the wind in the trees, the distant sound of a creek, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush. The forest kept its secrets. That was the truth Emily had to live with. The forest had taken Mark and Sarah, had hidden them, had scattered them, and it was never going to give them back. She could walk every trail, search every ravine, call their names until her voice gave out, and it wouldn't matter. They were gone. Not missing, not lost, gone. Absorbed into the earth and trees and water, part of the wilderness now, part of the cycle that cared nothing for human grief or human need for closure. On the 10-year anniversary of their disappearance, September 27, 2024, Emily stood at the trailhead where Sarah had taken that last photo. The sun was setting, the light filtering through the trees in shafts of gold and shadow. The forest was quiet, the way it always was, holding its breath, watching. Emily whispered their names one last time. Mark, Sarah. The words disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the vastness, unanswered. She turned and walked back to her car. Behind her, the forest closed in, the shadows deepening, the silence absolute. Somewhere in that wilderness, buried beneath moss and time, a silver Honda CR-V sat in a ravine, roots winding through its windows, nature reclaiming what had been taken. And somewhere, scattered and lost, Mark and Sarah Chen rested in a place no one would ever find. The forest had spoken its final word, and that word was silence.